I have been asked to do number 20 in section 0.4, which I'm very happy to do. So in this question, you want to find the formula for the inverse and state the domain for the inverse. So as usual, I really like to start things off by graphing it. So if you have any kind of a graphing program, you can go ahead and do that. We know that this is going to be an upside down parabola, and it's going to have roots at 0 and 1/5. So if we look at that, that's exactly what we see here. I'm going to move this down a little bit. Now, just to get an idea, what we first want to think about is the domain for the original function is x greater than or equal to 1. So what I'm going to do here is go to properties and change this domain so that it goes from, say, 1 to 20. It goes from more than that, but as you can see, if I move this up a little bit, okay, you can see then that this is just kind of a boring function here that stops here at 1 because that we're saying the domain is only when x is greater than 1. Okay, so now we want to just get a feel for what the inverse looks like. So again, this is the line y equals x. I'm going to make that a mirror, and then I'm going to imagine reflecting this point over this line. So I'm going to say transform reflect, and that makes sense because if we can imagine drawing a line perpendicular to the reflection line, that does seem to be about where it is. So I'm going to trace this point as I move x along here. Now what we notice then is that the point here is 1 comma negative 4. So when we switch it, then it's going to be negative 4 comma 1, which is right here. So the domain for the inverse function starts at negative 4 comma 1, but it's going to be anything for x less than negative 4. So that's part of the question, is what is the domain for the inverse function? So we would say x has to be less than negative 4. Alright, so this gives us some kind of an idea of what the domain is going to look like. But algebraically, how do we figure out how to find that? So let's just look at the algebra here. What we want to say is, we start out by saying the original function is y equals x minus 5x squared. And then we can switch the x and the y, so now we have y minus 5y squared. And again, since before we had x greater than or equal to 1, now we have y greater than or equal to 1 since we're switching this around. So then I'm just going to bring the x over to the other side here, and I'm going to get 0 equals negative 5y squared plus y minus x. And now when we have a situation like this, we can just use the quadratic formula because we want to solve for y. So recall that is y equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. So in this case, our a is negative 5, our b is 1, and our c is actually negative x. So it's the opposite of b, which would be the opposite of 1, plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is just 1, minus 4 times a, which is negative 5, and c, which is negative x. And that's all divided by 2a. Well, 2 times negative 5 is negative 10. So now I can factor out a negative 1 over negative 10, which would be just 1/10, and we're left with 1 plus or minus the square root of 1 minus 20x. Now, the next thing, so this is basically the idea for y, but we have two solutions here. So we have to remember, as we were talking about earlier, that the domain of the inverse is x is less than, oops, that should be negative 4. So the domain has to be less than negative 4. So we really have two functions here, 1/10 times 1 plus or minus, or plus this, and then 1 minus this. So let's look at each of those graphs. This one looks, recall, we're trying to get something that looks kind of like this, right? So that first one looks pretty good. Now let's, that's this one here, that's the 1 plus the 20x, 1 minus 20x, oops. And this one here oops, this red one here, is 1 minus the square root of 1 minus 20x. Well, here we go. I can see that that's coming off the screen there. So what we have is that this one is the correct branch, because we have to remember that y has to be greater than 1, which means that this function down here is y less than 1. So we basically don't need that part, and we just want to look at this function here. And again, we want to remember that the domain of the inverse is x less than or equal to negative 4. That should be negative 4. Okay, so that means that it's going to start here at negative 4 and go this way. So this is the function, and that's the domain. Hope this was helpful.